This event evokes in me fond memories of a previous moment, the conference of the Moscow Association of Analytical Psychology in 2011. That was for me a joyous occasion, the only opportunity I've had to experience Russia in person. I loved that time in Moscow with fellow Jungians, now friends. With affection, I wish especially to thank Natalia Pavlikova and Elena Purtova, who have been so kind to me. The invitation to participate in this conference presented me with a special opportunity. The theme surprised me: birds. How strange. What, if anything, I wondered, does that have to do with Jungian psychology? Then I reflected, even if it has something to do with Jungian psychology, it has nothing to do with me. But then, slowly but surely, I realized that birds have had a prolific presence in my life and a profound impact on my psyche. I noticed that birds are here, there, and everywhere. How could I have been so unconscious of a phenomenon so personally important to me? Psychoanalysts of all varieties worship Apollo, the god famous for the exhortation to know thyself. The archetype that governs psychoanalysis is self-knowledge. The ultimate purpose of the transformation and expansion of consciousness is for us to know ourselves. Psychoanalysis is a project to discern who we are, or in an even more ontologically radical sense, what we are, and to ascertain whether we have the libido, the gumption, the chutzpah, the moxie, the mojo, to assert that identity emphatically with all the authenticity intrinsic to it. I am, of course, a psychoanalyst, and more specifically, a Jungian analyst. Who and what, however, is Michael Vannoy Adams? Who am I, and what am I? Am I a man? Am I a bird? They say birds of a feather flock together. I say cats of a fur purr together. Anyone who knows me knows that I am a cat person. My wife, Yuna Chowdhury, is Dean for the Humanities at New York University. She's also collegiate professor of English, drama, and environmental studies. In the discipline of environmental studies, she specializes in animal studies, in particular animals in performance. One of her books has the title, The Stage Lives of Animals. It includes this dedication: for Mike, cat whisperer and paragon of animals. I love, love, love cats. Cats are radical introverts, and so am I. If I have a spirit animal, it is the cat. I'm a cat man. In the war between birds and cats, I'm for the cats and against the birds. However, it is also true that one of the cats I've had as a dear friend over the years, I named Chirp. I named her that because although she purred like a cat, she also chirped like a bird. So I have known and loved a bird cat. The name of my first cat was Stars and Stripes. The name of my last cat was Cat. The name of my new cat is Yowza. I confess that I have eaten birds. As a boy on the family farm in Texas, I saw my grandmother and my mother kill birds by beheading them barehanded. I watched them grab and grip the neck of a chicken, twirl the chicken around and around in the air until the head snapped off and the body fell to the ground, and then flopped around until it bled to death in the dirt. And then the women tossed the chicken into a big black cast iron pot full of boiling water on a flaming log fire in the backyard next to the smokehouse. And then the women pulled the chicken out and plucked the feathers out. And then the women carried the chicken into the house, where in the kitchen they cut it into pieces with a sharp steel knife, floured and salted it, and fried the chicken with lard in a cast iron skillet on the stove. I confess that I have killed birds. As a boy, I killed sparrows with an air rifle or BB gun, and I killed doves with a shotgun. I have never watched birds with binoculars. I have never known and loved a bird. I have never kept a bird as a pet. I have never confined a bird in a cage. I'm a Jungian analyst. I'm a therapist. I'm also an artist, a painter with a special interest in surrealism, the modernist aesthetic that Freudian psychoanalysis inspired. The artist René Magritte, a surrealist, painted The Therapist. In spite of such a specific title, Magritte, of course, might joke notoriously, "This is not a therapist." That is, technically, it's merely an image of a therapist, not the therapist as an object. Which specific features in the scene qualify the portrait as definitively surreal? The picture provocatively portrays the therapist as an invisible man, with the visual pun of a bird cage for a rib cage, and two identical white birds, one inside the cage, one outside the cage. Magritte conducts an optical experiment in perspectival relativity. He demonstrates how viewpoint defines the difference between inside and outside as spatial dimensions. Whether this white bird or that white bird is inside or outside the cage depends on the point of view of the viewer. On the front door of our apartment in New York is a welcome that proclaims "Happy Nest," the name of the beloved house in which my wife lived as a child in India. I lettered the card with two words, and then I painted it with two birds, one red bird, one yellow bird, a brown nest, and 4 blue eggs. The image on the cover of my last book, For Love of the Imagination, is Ghosts of Birds, a fabric needlework embroidery application by Chris Antio. In the scene, skeletal birds fly across a black starry sky above flowers, a woman, and of course, a bird. The bird on the coat of arms of Russia is the golden eagle. The bird on the Great Seal of America is the bald eagle. Why eagles? Benjamin Franklin regretted that the bald eagle was the bird of America. He considered the bald eagle a bird of bad character, a creature of cowardice. He wished that the bird of America had been the turkey, a creature of courage. What would we think? How would we feel if the bird on the Great Seal of America were not an eagle, but a turkey? Just as nations have birds, so do states. For example, the state bird of Texas, where I was born and raised, is the mockingbird. The word mocking in the name reflects the fact that the bird lacks its own unique song, and that as a result, it imitates, it mimics, that is, it mocks other birds' songs. The song that introduced me to popular music was a song about a bird, Mockingbird Hill. The time was the early 1950s. I was only 5 or 6 years old. As I recall the occasion, it was a very special treat, lunch with my father at a cafe. We sat at a table in a booth, and while we ate, we listened to a jukebox. One of the vinyl records was Mockingbird Hill by Les Paul. In jazz and rock and roll history, the inventor of the solid body electric guitar, and Mary Ford, the singer who sang the lyrics of the song so sweetly that she transported a little boy into an ecstatic state. Another bird, the blackbird, has been musically important to me. The specific song in this case is Bye Bye Blackbird. I especially admire the improvisational renditions so exquisitely played by the perfectionist jazz prodigies Miles Davis on trumpet and Keith Jarrett on piano. Then, of course, there's also that other song, Blackbird, written by Paul McCartney with John Lennon, recorded by the Beatles, and sung by McCartney on the White Album. Half a century ago, while at the University of Texas, I contributed as a journalist to a politically liberal publication, the Texas Observer. The source material for one article that I wrote was an interview that I conducted with a political activist at a penitentiary where he was a prisoner, or as sympathizers characterized him, a political prisoner. He had organized civil rights and Vietnam War protests, and police had arrested him or entrapped him for possession and sale of marijuana. He was a black man. In slang, a cell in a prison is a cage, and a prisoner is a jailbird. Lee Otis Johnson was, in that sense, a blackbird. I quoted as an epigram for the article these lines from the Beatles song. Blackbird singing in the dead of night, take these broken wings and learn to fly. All your life, you were only waiting for this moment to arise. Many years later, Paul McCartney revealed that the compositional inspiration for those lines was the civil rights protest by 9 black students who arose against segregation in public schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. Charlie Manson interpreted those lines more radically as cryptic proof that the decisive moment had finally arrived for black people to arise against white people in America. Blackbird was one of the Beatles songs that Charlie played most frequently for the Manson family in the acid trip group sex commune. The motive for the infamous murders that hippies committed under manipulation by Manson, or alternatively, infatuation with Manson, was to incite a race revolution in America. An example of outsider art that I own is a scene that depicts 3 blackbirds on a fence with a black dog and 4 sunflowers in a field. Aileen Harris, a Black woman, a Southern folk artist, painted the picture. An example of mythological art that I own features 2 bird men, Daedalus with Icarus at the climactic moment, the catastrophic instant, wings in flames. Michael P. Jenkins, artist and psychoanalyst, painted the picture. An example of environmental art is this triptych, Una becoming penguin, which documents the transformation of my wife, Una Chaudhry, into a bird, her spirit animal, the penguin. The sequential prints are by Marina Zurko, her collaborator on the project Dear Climate. The title of this presentation is I Was a Bluebird. The subtitle is Identity and Participation. The presentation is about personal experiences of birds over 3/4 of a century of life. I wax nostalgic, I indulge in reverie, I free associate, I recount anecdotes. This presentation is also about theoretical and practical dimensions of identity as a concept in psychology, and more specifically in Jungian psychology. Who am I, or what am I? For example, a man or a bird? And what does such a question, if it has any answer at all, even mean? I could emphasize identity crises, as the psychoanalyst Erik Erikson did more than half a century ago in his famous book, Identity, Youth and Crisis. Or I could emphasize identity politics, as so many presumptuous activists currently do with such ideological fervor and collective certitude. Identity crises and identity politics are not unimportant, but for the purpose of this presentation, I prefer to address the concept of identity uncritically and apolitically. What I propose as an alternative is to employ another concept as a means to that end. That concept is participation. Jung appropriates that concept from anthropology and applies it to psychology. He acknowledges and properly cites as the source of this concept Lucien Levy-Bruhl, who posits a principle which is peculiar to primitive mentality and proposes as an apt name for it, the law of participation. Levy-Bruhl describes 2 different mentalities, a primitive mentality and a modern mentality. I should note that Levy-Bruhl presents these mentalities as 2 different stages in the history of consciousness, but he does not reify them. Although in theory they are to a certain extent different stages of consciousness, in practice they're different styles of consciousness, or what I prefer to call emphases. Levy-Bruhl maintains that the thinking of primitives tends to emphasize the law of participation, while the thinking of moderns tends to emphasize the law of contradiction. That's how he represents their thinking in contrast to our thinking. I merely wish to state that it does not bind itself down, as our thought does, to avoiding contradiction, Lévi-Bruhl says. It obeys the law of participation first and foremost. Lévi-Bruhl applies the concept of participation to the Bororo, subsequently famous as the tribe among whom Claude Lévi-Strauss conducted ethnological research in Brazil. In contrast to Lévi-Strauss, Lévi-Bruhl had no personal experience as an anthropologist in Brazil to qualify him as a primary source for any assertion about the ostensible beliefs of the Bororo. He had no direct contact with the Bororo. Lévi-Bruhl asserts that the Bororo believe in earnest that they are birds. He derives the assertion not from observation of or conversation with the Bororo, but exclusively from a secondary source, a late 19th century account of an expedition to Brazil by Karl Fundensteinen, an anthropologist from Germany. He is the sole scholar whom Lévi-Bruhl, in an appeal to authority, quotes as the necessary and sufficient expert on the topic. The book in which Lévi-Bruhl cites Fundensteinen with such unambivalent approbation is in precise but pretended translation from French, Les fonctions mentales dans les sociétés inférieures, to English, Mental Functions in Inferior Societies, a title that transparently exposes pervasively implicit, systemically unconscious, nonchalantly pretentious attitudinal and behavioral supremacy of the West. A mere 4 years before, in 1914, the mental functions of putatively superior societies of civilization, in a grand gesture of sheer genius, invented the modernist novelties of World War and class revolution to entertain the 20th century as preparation ultimately for the uniquely charismatic aesthetics of genocidal depravity and atomic totalitarianism. When the book, which was originally published in French in 1910, was finally published in English in 1926, the title was translated as How Natives Think. That is, the book was retitled. This act was a salutary amelioration of the initial ethnocentric condescension about inferiority, but it was also, of course, simultaneously of euphemistic dissimulation. The Bororo do not believe that they're just any birds. They believe that they are special birds. The feathers in the headdresses that Bororo wear are from Arara, red parrots, the totem of the tribe. These are Bororo tribesmen with beautifully flamboyant headdresses of bird feathers. Here are 2 red Arara. Here is 1 red Arara in a close-up. This is my wife, Una Chaudhry, with Arara. This is a Bororo tribesman with the traditional headdress of Aurora feathers. The most provocative categorical assertion is that the Bororos sincerely believe, not metaphorically but literally, not frivolously but seriously, with no qualifications or equivocations, with no ifs, ands, or buts about it, that they, men, are also parrots, that they are parrots in fact, not in fantasy, but in reality. The contention that they are simultaneously both men and parrots is not, at least as the Bororo experience it, and as they presumably possess the capacity to comprehend it, a fallacy, an illogical proposition, in this case, a contradiction in terms. When the Bororo express the belief that they are parrots, what they desire to express by it, Lévi-Brühl emphatically declares, is actual identity. As Lévi-Brühl parses it, the Bororo adamantly insist that they and red parrots are actually identical, that they are not separate and distinct, or similar in some respects but different in other respects, or identical only in part but not in whole, or identical only in degree but not in kind, or identical as a potentiality in future but not as an actuality at present, but that they are entirely, truly, utterly, at the same time, at this very time, one and the same, both men and birds. That is how Lévi-Brühl defines the mental function of participation. It is an essentialist definition of identity through identification, total, intrinsic, and integral. In the tribal belief system, the Bororo identify not with red parrots, but as red parrots. Michael Polanyi, the scientist and philosopher of a science with whom I so happily had the opportunity and privilege to study a half-century ago, also mentions the Bororo. He comments that the equation Bororos are red parrots is not as such a patently preposterous proposition. The relative prestige of the belief is dependent, Polanyi remarks, on the extent to which the belief is in accord with the particular sense of plausibility that is irreducibly distinctive to Bororos, that is, to believers. As difficult as it may be to comprehend precisely what Bororos mean when they express the belief that they are, in fact, birds, that belief is not necessarily any more absurd, Polanyi ironically notes, than the reductionistic belief of many scientists and philosophers that they are machines. The equation men are machines, a conceit available since the middle of the 18th century when Julien Offray de la Mettrie introduced the notion, is no more an ineluctable verity or absurdity than the equation men are birds. For Polanyi, the identification men are machines is merely a contemporary example of what Lévi-Brühl means by participation. Exactly which societies are inferior or superior in mental functions, and exactly who says so and why. Baltimore is a city with two professional sports teams. Both have the names of birds. The baseball team are the Orioles. The football team are the Ravens, a nomenclatural homage to Edgar Allan, the poetic Poe, who lived and wrote and died in Baltimore. and an allusion to that refrain of a rhyme, quoth the raven, nevermore. The psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan once quipped, the best image to sum up the unconscious is Baltimore in the early morning. Baltimoreans identify with orioles or ravens, but they do not identify as orioles or ravens. In contrast, Bororos identify as parrots, not with parrots. Baltimoreans who cheer at a baseball game, we're the Orioles, or at a football game, we're the Ravens, do not believe, as Bororos ostensibly do, that they actually are birds. They merely exuberantly express the camaraderie they experience in solidarity as members of a community of sports enthusiasts. In this respect, the difference between Baltimoreans and Bororos is the difference between fans with mascots and a tribe with a totem. When Jung mentions the Bororo, he remarks that although they are perfectly conscious that they do not possess the physical appearance necessary and sufficient to satisfy the criteria for taxonomic classification as birds, they maintain that they are nonetheless authentically birds. Certain South American Indians, Jung notes, assure you that they are red araras, parrots, although they are quite aware that they have no feathers and don't look like birds. To the Bororo, such a discrepancy hardly constitutes a refutation of tribal identity as totemic parrots. The capacity of the Bororo to countenance such an incongruity and sustain the conviction that they are birds, even if they don't appear to be birds, Jung contends, is simply an artifactual function of a certain stage in the history of consciousness. In the primitives' worlds, he asserts, things do not have the same sharp boundaries they do in ours. Previously, the boundaries between things, among them the boundaries between beings, such as men and birds, were much more pervious. Jung posits and laments that the phenomenon of participation, conceptually synonymous with what he terms psychic identity, was a tendency much more actively prevalent between things in the past than it is in the present. Then things were not, as things are now, separate and distinct from other things. The law of participation prevailed. Things took part in or partook of other things. The principal criterion that renders modern mentality significantly different from what Lévi-Bruhl terms primitive mentality, Jung maintains, is not only the capacity, but also a propensity to differentiate the literal from the metaphorical. For moderns, if men state that they are parrots, they must mean it metaphorically. If they mean it literally, then they, in effect, concede that it's false. For men are not, in fact, parrots. Not only logically, but also empirically, they are men, not parrots. They do not have feathers, and they do not fly. They do not look like birds, and they do not act like birds. Men are men, parrots are parrots, men are not parrots. Such is the factuality of metaphor and modernity. The Bororo, however, state that men are parrots. They mean it literally, and they insist that it is true. They do not mean that men are similar to parrots. They mean that men are identical with parrots. They say what they mean, and they mean what they say. They say it, they mean it, and they believe it. When the Bororo wear a headdress of feathers, they do not do so in order to pretend to be parrots. When the Bororo say that they are parrots, it is not make-believe, but belief. How abstract or concrete is an identity? Am I a bird? If so, am I a bird as a species, a bird as a breed, or a bird as a pet? For example, a parrot. Perhaps that proverbial bird with the proper name, Polly, that craves a cracker and desperately, nonsensically perseverates. In contrast to the Bororo, when we say that a person is a parrot, in all probability, we simply mean that the vocal behavior of the person is identical to that of a parrot, that the person parrots other people, that he or she only ever repeats, word for word, what other people say with no comprehension of what the words mean. As the inventive verb form, to parrot is to reiterate incessantly a totally unoriginal, monotonously imitative utterance in utter incomprehension of what it might mean. Jung notes that projection is an extremely common phenomenon and remarks that it's synonymous with participation. He also maintains that primitives have more of a proclivity to project than moderns do. It's a simple truth, he opines, that they are, and this is the operative word that he employs, somewhat more prone to projection than we are. That is, in terms of projection, they are different from us, not in kind, but in degree. When the Bororo call a man a parrot, they mean it seriously. In contrast, Jung says, those occasions when we call a person a goose, a cow, a hen, a snake, an ox, or an ass are for us opportunities to indulge in a snidely humorous zinger. In English, it is common to call a woman a hen, a cow, or a goose, and it's common to call a man a snake, an ox, or an ass. When we call a man or woman a specific animal, when we call him or her this or that animal, we mean it not literally, but metaphorically. And often, probably more often than not, we mean it pejoratively. In such cases, the metaphor is an epithet. These uncomplimentary epithets, Jung observes, are familiar to us all. When we call a person an animal, we mean it figuratively. Jung says that such equations have become with us a mere figure of speech, like so much else. To take them literally is, from the modern point of view, to mistake them. If we take our metaphors concretely, that is, if we take them literally, we return, Jung says, to the primitive point of view. We momentarily regress, he reckons, to a stage in the history of consciousness that we have not so much superseded as abated. Certain animals have accrued a reputation, one that in all probability they didn't earn and don't deserve. Such animals are often famous or notorious for a definitively distinctive characteristic that is in effect a specialty. This is a singular characteristic that ostensibly epitomizes or perfectly exemplifies these animals. Putatively, these animals possess a property that's tantamount to an essence, a quality that is the very epitome of these animals. although it is important, in fact, it is imperative to acknowledge that an attribute may not, in fact, be an intrinsic trait always already in these animals, but may be only an arbitrary attribution, the imposition of a mere imputation, the ascription of an anthropocentric presumption, or in psychoanalytic terms, a projection of a pure figment of the imagination into, or even more superficially onto, these animals. If any significant difference between primitives and moderns does exist as a stage in the history of consciousness, and any such proposition, I submit, is speculatively problematic, it cannot be a natural difference in kind, but only a cultural difference in degree. For evolutionarily, they and we are, for all intents and purposes, biologically identical, and have been for at least the last 160,000 years. That is the existential span of the species that so modestly proclaims the conceit that it is uniquely sapient or wise. As the Darwinian paradigm definitively demonstrates, any psychologically relevant difference between primitives and moderns must be a function not of nature, but of culture, which of course includes technology. For Jung, the fundamental difference between primitives and moderns is that they tend more often to obey the law of participation, while we tend more often to obey the law of contradiction. When they say, I am simultaneously a man and a bird, they apply the law of participation. When we say, I cannot be simultaneously a man and a bird, we apply the law of contradiction. To us, the terms man and bird are contradictory. They are mutually exclusive. The issue, of course, is the persistence of a belief in spite of the existence of evidence, ample and cogent, to contradict that belief. The tendency among the Bororo is for them to conflate men with parrots rather than, as the Bororo have a perfect aptitude to do, to differentiate men from parrots. It is not that the Bororo have no capacity to differentiate subject from object or self from other. Rather, it is that they simply have a preference not to do so. What, as an alternative, they apparently please to do is to conflate subject with object. For example, men with parrots. This conflation is, of course, what Lévi-Brühl means by participation. Jung characterizes participation as the hallmark of primitive mentality. As Lévi-Brühl delineates the phenomenon as a stage in the history of consciousness, Jung remarks, it is simply the indefinitely large remnant of non-differentiation between subject and object. The capacity to differentiate between subject and object is the necessary and sufficient condition for the emergence and the existence of consciousness as such. When there is no consciousness of the difference between subject and object, an unconscious identity prevails, Jung notes. The unconscious is then projected into the object, and the object is introjected into the subject. Projection and introjection concurrently occur. Among various options that such a circumstance affords, Jung observes, is the opportunity to believe, as the Bororo do, that human beings are at the same time animals. Of course, in a perfectly trivial taxonomic sense, human beings are animals and not, for example, plants. We are human animals. We are humanimals. Jung remarks that consciousness presupposes a differentiation into subject and object and a relation between them. There is a presupposition that self and other are irreducibly different. Where there is no other, or it does not yet exist, Jung declares, all possibility of consciousness ceases. At the extreme, an ingenuous acceptance of the factuality of participation as a phenomenon apathetically countenances unconsciousness and entails the facile, fallacious, and false conclusion that, as Jung says, fundamentally we are identical with everybody and everything. This proposition assumes precisely what it should argue. It reasons circularly and begs the question. In primitive mentality, the subject may be identical with the object, as Bororos are, or purport to be identical with Auroras. But in modern mentality, however similar the subject may be to the object, it is never reductively identical with it, but always inimitably different from it. The subject may empathize with the object, that is, the self may temporarily transpose itself into the position of the other in an attempt intimately to experience the alterity of a particular state of affairs from that perspective. But in modernity, the subject does not identify as the object. Of all the birds in my life, the most personally important has been the bluebird. This, for example, is my bone china teacup with a bluebird that's obviously a beauty. The songs that years ago I sang to my son and daughter to sing them asleep and sing them awake were both bluebird songs from the movies. Judy Garland as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, singing the line, "Somewhere over the rainbow, bluebirds fly." And James Baskett as Uncle Remus in Song of the South, singing the line, "Mr. Bluebird's on my shoulder." I wish to thank Natalia Pavlikova, who, in conversation with me in preparation for this presentation, mentioned the Cold War Soviet-American collaboration on The Bluebird, the 1976 movie with Elizabeth Taylor, of the Maeterlinck play that Stanislavski directed at the Moscow Art Theater in 1908. In recent years, by far the most famous bluebird served as corporate logo of an extremely important social media platform. The organization ingeniously integrated image and words. The image was a rather abstract, visually stylish bluebird. The company name was, of course, Twitter. In the ornithological context, the word Twitter means chirps or tremulous sounds. In the digital data paradigm, the word tweet means a short, quick communication. For example, a text message with a limit of 140 characters. As Elon Musk acquired the corporation for a mere $44 billion, in an iconoclastic gesture, he abolished the bluebird as corporate logo and changed the company name from Twitter to X. It is notorious that Musk has a special interest in and affection for the letter X. He likes or loves the letter X so much that he and Grimes endowed a child with the name X-A12, nickname, of course, X. For Musk, the letter X exudes a quality of mystery, but why? It may be because X is a letter that may also serve as a number, that is, serve in mathematics as an independent variable, and X with a value that no one knows, at least not yet, in an attempt to solve an equation. The opportunity to solve a problem, extremely difficult if not impossible, is exactly the challenge that most excites the mischievous imagination of Musk and libidinally motivates him to excel. Russia or the Soviet Union had young pioneers. America had Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. Before Girl Scouts, America had Campfire Girls, the very first youth organization, especially for girls. Campfire Girls were established in 1910. My mother, who was born in 1906, was trained in the 1930s to be a professional in that organization. She was executive director of Campfire Girls in San Diego, California, and Dallas, Texas. She had a proud and impressive career as a modern woman in the 20th century. The logo of the organization was a red, white, and blue image of a campfire with a flame above two logs. I recently happened to encounter a quite peculiar and, to me, humorous variation on that theme. It's a campfire image that unconsciously is ironically communist, at least stylistically. Not a hammer and sickle, but instead of two logs under a flame, a hammer and broom. In the traditional sexual or sexist division of labor, men or fathers nail and women or mothers sweep. Little girls too young to be campfire girls were bluebirds. At the camps that my mother managed and supervised in the summer at woods and lakes with lots and lots of girls, I was the only little boy. When I was 4 or 5 years old, I was an honorary bluebird. In that pretend sense, even a little boy who wasn't a little girl could be a bluebird. As a little boy, I loved that identity. I also loved the beautiful logo on the red, white, and blue uniform of the Bluebirds. Eventually, my little sister became a bluebird, not an honorary little boy bluebird like me, but a real little girl bluebird. A few years ago, I bought a small metal enamel pin, the logo of the Bluebirds. I wear it on the lapel of a jacket with blue and white stripes. Our ornament at the top of our tree at Christmas, the birthday of our son, is a bluebird. I once was a bluebird. I still am a bluebird. I always will be a bluebird.